Good morning. Thank you. A half-century after Wagner's death, the ceremonial character of his final drama was exploited politically at that historical juncture when the Weimar Republic collapsed and Germany became a totalitarian state. This supplied the National Socialists with a pretext to equate events in Parsifal with those in real life. 1933 was not only a Wagner anniversary year, but also the year Hitler came to power. In his 1933 Parsifal book, Alfred Lorenz seized upon this historical convergence, akin to the fateful events that Thomas Mann, in chapter 25 of his novel Dr. Faustus, has the devil describe as Tatsachen der Weltstunde, to identify Wagner's work of sublime aspiration with Hitler's ascent. Granting Wagner the power of political prophecy, Lorenz announces in his preface that, quote, Wagner conveyed his prophetic thoughts about leadership of the Führer and regeneration in his work and bequeathed thereby an exalted mission. To what extent did Parsifal allow or encourage such ceremonial use in this political context? No other Wagnerian drama offered a conclusion so well suited to glorification of a new leader replacing the old order. It comes, therefore, as no great surprise that posters from the time depicted Hitler as a Parsifal-like figure. The Führer appears here bearing a Nazi flag while an eagle-like bird hovers. The eagle or Reichsadler in the poster is highly stylized with a mechanized appearance suggesting a military plane almost as much as a regal bird. Light streaming from above identifies the leader as a Lichtgestalt. Lorenz's interpretative move in identifying Hitler as Parsifal in his Parsifal book was not an original idea, but an assimilation of propaganda long in circulation. Propaganda that Wagner's son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, helped set into motion by hailing Hitler as a, quote, God-sent benediction, unquote, to Germany 9 years earlier. The Bayreuth Circle, and Chamberlain in particular, not only aided and abetted Hitler, but helped create the future dictator, who absorbed Chamberlain's ideology and revered his memory. In this regard, the saga of three kings, as embodied in Parsifal, that is, Titurel, Amfortas, Parsifal, supported belief in a, quote, rare figure of light, unquote, in Chamberlain's words, at a time of troubles. In some analogies from this time, the founding Grail king Titurel was identified with Friedrich the Great, providing a richer historical backdrop to the mythic glorification of Hitler as Germany's redeemer. In so treading the minefields of art and ideology, I shall focus my remarks this morning on the conclusion of Parsifal, which provokes continuing controversy, especially on account of the death of Kundry, the drama's only important female figure. Several of the most probing stagings of the ending of Parsifal have departed from Wagner's original stage directions for the ending. In more recent productions, Kundry often does not die, and is instead shown sharing her fate with others. In Harry Kupfer's 1992 Berlin staging, for instance, Amfortas dies instead of Kundry, while Parsifal is plagued by doubts about his new role as Grail King. At the close of Nikolaus Leinhof's production from 1999, the knights break into two groups. A conservative faction remains with Gornemans, to whom Parsifal has entrusted the spear as a symbol of orthodoxy. Other individual knights break away to follow Kundry and Parsifal, who depart toward a lighted but ominous, undisclosed destination following a railway track. In Peter Konvichny's 1995 Munich staging, Kundry is both idealized and dehumanized by the knights as she comes to stand for the Grail itself. For Vazsonyi, the problem of the Grail community centers on its exclusion of women. His approach reflects a widespread tendency to regard the Grail as embodiment of a suppressed feminine aspect of Christianity. This makes sense in view of the Grail's connotation as a feminine symbol, a dish or womb, which is complemented by the phallic symbol of the spear. But if this pair of archetypal objects are reunited at the conclusion, where does that leave Kundry as the only consequential female character in Parsifal? Even if the unseen mixed choirs heard from the dome convey a universalizing androgyny, her own mute departure from the visible action at an emphatic A minor chord, the final chromatic inflection in the music, provokes interpretation. Vazsonyi regards it as deeply tragic in import. Lorenz lamely suggested that, quote, even woman is admitted to the temple, unquote. But Wagner wanted Kundry to vanish from the living precisely at the moment of achievement of the restitutio in integrum, as Parsifal reveals the glowing grail. In the context of the aesthetic depiction of redemption, Kundry's role in the drama seems to embody an unreconciled dimension, even perhaps a critique of the integrative close. One is reminded here of her double reincarnation in Act 3. She first appears as a penitent, uttering only, to serve, to serve. However, in the Good Friday scene, in which she's baptized by Parsifal, Kundry undergoes a final transformation, unmistakably becoming a silent re-embodiment of Mary Magdalene, the Mary Magdalene of both the Bible and of Wagner's incomplete drama, Jesus of Nazareth. The only character in Parsifal who has encountered the Redeemer directly is Kundry, who laughed at the suffering Savior on the cross, whose gaze met hers. Her act of malicious schadenfreude is reversed in Act 3, when Kundry as Mary Magdalene washes Parsifal's feet and dries them with her hair. Kundry's last reincarnation is explicitly bound up with Christianity, though any mention of Christ by name is avoided, while her role is conveyed no longer through words, just music and pantomime. Kundry's highly paradoxical history and nature, stemming from her genesis out of discrete mythological characters, her cycle of reincarnations, and her split existence between Grail and anti-Grail, enriches but complicates her role at the close of Parsifal with its reinstatement of the Grail service. One is reminded here of those so-called heretical Gnostic sources excluded from the Bible, but buried in the desert for safekeeping and discovered only in 1945, a century after Wagner's original close reading of Eschenbach's Parsifal at Marienbad in 1845. A poem found at Nag Hammadi that springs to mind is Thunder, Complete Mind, quote, "Do not be ignorant of me at any time, for I am the first and the last. I'm the honored one, and I'm the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I'm the wife and the virgin. I'm the mother and the daughter. I'm the barren one, and many are her children. I am she whose wedding is great, and I have not taken a husband," unquote. Kundry, too, is a radically contradictory compound figure expressed through riddling antitheses. A, quote, whore and holy one, whose, quote, kiss of love is the last mother's greeting, unquote, who scorns Klingsor while serving him, and whose very name Kundry stands for enlarged knowledge, while Gornemans finds her just as dumb as the pure fool Parsifal when he first arrives in the Grail realm. She is a figure who resists unambiguous assimilation. casting thereby at least a shadow of doubt on wholly positive assessments of the utopian character of the conclusion, such as Ulrike Kienzler's conviction that Kundry achieves nirvana, entering, quote, into the eternal presence of the divine, unquote. A more cautious judgment about the conclusion by mezzo-soprano Waltraud Meyer, an outstanding proponent of the role, is that, quote, Kundry yearns to be able to die, to escape from the vicious circle of unending reincarnations and at last find redemption. Consequently, she should be able to die at the conclusion, unquote. Play 2 shows Meyer as Kundry in tense confrontation with Klingsor, here played by and sung by Günther von Kannen. Another consideration is advanced by Stefan Mersch. If Kundry is a guilt-ridden heathen figure with a restless, wandering past, bearing in this context a certain parallel to Jewishness without that explicit identification, who cannot, even after being converted, endure a confrontation with the renewed spiritual force of the grail, this configuration may imply a concept of redemption that is tainted by anti-Semitism. Support for this view can be found both in the drama's dualistic framework and in the early reception history of Parsifal. Kundry's role as seductress in bondage to Klingsor has encouraged comparison to the allegorical Frau Welt, or worldly feminine figure of the Middle Ages, whose front side depicts an attractive, sensual woman. When viewed from the back, the same figure is shown being consumed by worms and other parasites. By contrast, the community of knights is shown in Act 1 being sustained by sustenance spent by the grail, as divine blood is transformed into the somewhat banal March-like manifestation of bodily strength and power, or Leibeskraft und Stärke, which involves a variant of the work's opening communion theme. As you recall from the Act 1 scene, after the grail is revealed, we hear with march-like dotted rhythms in support of this anthem-like version of the opening communion theme of the Grail in this transformation. The revitalization of the Knights is bound up with their faith, as is confirmed by the ensuing a cappella voices heard from the dome, blessed in belief, selig im Glauben. That this favored collective group in the drama seemed uncomfortably compatible with the reactionary politics of the day was already perceived by some early commentators. As early as the 1880s, members of the Bayreuth Circle often fancied themselves as Knights of the Grail. Already in 1882, Max Kalbeck wrote sarcastically in the Wiener Allgemeine Zeitung about a, quote, modern hero of faith or Christian Germanic savior that, quote, the anti-Semitic folks should express thanks to Wagner for this blonde Christ, unquote. Depictions by Franz Stassen of the end of Parsifal give further pause for thought. Stassen was an artist friend of Siegfried Wagner and member of the Bayreuth Circle since 1908, who joined the National Socialist Party in 1930. Stassen illustrated scenes from many of Siegfried Wagner's works and acted as witness at his wedding to Winifred Klindworth, then known as Senta Klindworth, in 1915. Stassen received a professorship through the intervention of Hitler, who accorded him special honors. 2 of Stassen's 15 completed scenes based on Parsifal are shown here and in the following image, which you'll see in a second. This first depiction shows the young Parsifal holding up the holy spear in his right hand while light streams down from on high, and Kundry lies at his feet amid wilted flowers. In the second depiction, an older, more experienced, Christ-like Parsifal holds the grail while the dove hovers. Kundry gazes upward, and the assembled knights stare transfixed. Both images incorporate musical motives or notation alluding specifically to Wagner's work. In the second depiction, the ascending sequences of the resolved form of the opening communion theme, leading to the D-flat chord at the final word of the choral text, Erlöser, Redeemer, appear. This is the sonority heard immediately before Kundry's death at the ensuing A minor chord, whereas the framing design of angelic figures corresponds in the musical realization to the unseen choral voices from the dome singing, "Redeemed the Redeemer." It will be seen that the Hitler poster we've discussed, let's return to it for a moment, combines the imagery of Stassen's two depictions of the end of Parsifal. In place of the Holy Spear as the focus of light streaming from above, Hitler carries a Nazi flag in his upraised right hand. Instead of the dove and assembled knights, the German leader stands beneath a hovering eagle with shining light from above in front of a host of his brown-shirted followers. These followers are not shown as distinct individuals, but as uniform examples of a type. A comparison might be drawn to Goya's famous painting, the 3rd of May, 1808, with its depiction of the hard, inhuman brutality of the undifferentiated row of soldiers making up the firing squad. Stassen was no stranger to political propaganda. His strident World War I poster, An das deutsche Volk, opposing surrender in the war, achieved wide circulation. Even if the Hitler poster is not by Stassen, it shows a similar treatment in its iconography and symbolism. Its decorated border is atypical for a poster. You see the elaborate decorated border with the typical oak leaf motto. But it's characteristic of Stassen's mythic illustrations. The affinity of these depictions is a sobering, painful reminder of the ways in which images from Wagner's drama were ideologically transposed. In this context, the outsider role of Kundry assumes special importance. The music at Kundry's death consists of 4 Takte, 4 measures, that became the object of Wagner's revisions on the very last page of his orchestral draft as he shortened and focused the conclusion. And you see them at the very top. He actually writes there 4 measures, 4 Takte. These measures magnify the 2-measure inflection heard in Act 1 when the squires return the grail to its shrine. Each harmony is now augmented to occupy a whole measure. The shift from the D-flat major chord to the A minor sonority is reached through semitone motion in the 3 upper voices, generating a darkening, even uncanny inflection. Already emphasized in Act 1, this chromatic progression is now given emphatic treatment as the outcome of a crescendo to forte in the full orchestra, with the gesture marked by a timpani roll and a rising arpeggiation in the strings reinforced by rapid broken chords in the harps. And just to remind you of the passage, we shift from this sonority on the D-flat chord to the augmented A minor sonority here. In early January 1882, just after Wagner completed the full score of Parsifal, he confessed to Cosima that he had feared his labors might have been overtaken by his death. Taking a long look back on his life that night, Wagner sang a ballade from his first opera, Die Feen, before his thoughts turned to this A minor chord at which Kundry expires, and to the performance demands of its wind parts. Quote, his remarks to her were recorded as follows, quote, "The A minor chord, where Kundry collapses, would make an impression on you. It is the terror of holiness that emanates there. It must be rendered very beautifully," unquote. One is tempted to associate this gesture with Wagner's proud comment from February 1879 concerning the, quote, "most beautiful sound of annihilation of the timpani, the Vernichtungsklang der Pauke," at Kundry's baptism. Unlike that earlier passage, the A minor chord is indeed supported by timpani. It represents a sound of annihilation since it marks her collapse and death. Is Kundry merely consigned to oblivion, or does she ascend into nirvana, freed at last from her cycle of reincarnations? The expression terror of holiness evokes the numinous, a category of experience explored by Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy. The dark shudder at Kundry's death points past the boundaries of the drama's ceremonial framework. For Otto, the numinous invokes the mysterium tremendum, a sense of fearful awe resisting artistic representation, a quality, as he puts it, on the verge of extinguishing, unquote, that can be made more perceptible through contrast, as occurs here through the parenthetical placement of this glimpse of the beyond encased within Wagner's spiral of fifths, that forms the positive integrative resolution. The integrative resolution itself would deserve much attention. It involves a masterful synthesis of many motives and elements from the entire work that are combined together, revealing their underlying affinities. Of all the figures in Parsifal, Kundry stands most fully for opposites in interaction, embodying the clash of the grail and anti-grail. The silence and withdrawal of Kundry in Act 3 strangely parallels the rejection in Orthodox Christianity of those Gnostic visions like thunder, complete mind, quote, that lift their hearers beyond apocalyptic polarities to see each one of us as a whole, having the capacity for both cruelty and compassion, as Elaine Pagels puts it. This musical setting of Kundry's death challenges our imagination and is more resistant than the integrative conclusion to the leveling, even corrosive effects of utopian ideology. Peter Conrad's accusation that, quote, Wagnerian providence leaves his characters with an afflicted sense of being immured in a forbiddingly unified work of art, unquote, does not apply here. The figure of Kundry defies such ensnarement from within. For us today, the recognition of the ideological transgression of a marginalized Kundry even heightens her importance. Her aloofness or disquieting exclusion from the shared redemptive outcome has prompted revisionist interventions while stimulating critique of the Grail order as a closed and ailing society. This is as it should be, especially in view of the disastrous German reception history from which the work cannot be entirely detached. The self-serving, opportunistic, quote, community of the chosen, unquote, that evolved into the Bayreuth Circle serves as a warning that should not be forgotten. With the stunted focus of the first half-century of German reception of Parsifal supplanted by more recent approaches and interrogating the meaning of the Grail ceremony, the valuable core idea of compassion can assume an unrestricted priority. It is here, to borrow a distinction from Walter Benjamin, that the truth content, Wahrheitsgehalt, as opposed to the material content, Sachgehalt, of the work is best sought. Knowing through compassion, this ethical notion was negated and turned into its opposite through the aggressive politics of racial glorification and exclusion. And it is not surprising that National Socialists like Lorenz and Rosenberg struggled with the qualities of gentleness or renunciation in Parsifal. Parsifal's nonviolent use of the spear as an instrument of healing is not compatible with the chauvinistic worldview that the composer's heirs at Bayreuth avidly embraced. Nevertheless, we should regard this symbolism cautiously, bearing in mind that Wagner presumably adapted the motive of the healing spear from the Greek legend of Telephus in order to provide the needed connection between Amphortus, Parsifal, and the undisclosed Redeemer whose prophecy is revealed through the grail. When first envisioning a festival of his works, more than 3 decades before realizing Parsifal at Bayreuth, Wagner expressed his aim of conveying his artistic intentions through, quote, sensuous and not critical understanding, unquote. But a measure of critical insight is vitally important to fruitful engagement with Parsifal. An example of stimulating reinterpretation is Harry Kupfer's intervention in having Amphortus die and Kundry live in his production, a transposition that is nonetheless problematic on account of its muddling of the prophecy and healing lance. Wagner was originally drawn to the Parsifal material on account of the suffering of Amphortus. As often in Greek tragedy, the intense suffering, and in Kupfer's staging, eventual death, of a once powerful individual lies at the center of the drama, whereas the survival of Kundry registers discomfort over the work's original social context, that unpalatable political agenda that plagued the reception history at Bayreuth for more than 50 years. Let's now view the closing passage, just 3 minutes, of Parsifal and Kupfer's production. We can put on the DVD. The issues attending the political symbolism of Wagner's Parsifal figure can be further clarified by analogy to the famous depiction of Germania by Philip Veit, dating from March 1848, at the time of the ill-fated revolution. The term Germania stems from the widely circulated ethnographic work Germania, written by Tacitus around 98 AD. Veit's Germania figure is softened by the presence of the hemp branch, denoting peace. The double eagle coat of arms and oak leaves in the hair are German symbols. Scrutiny of the Germania figure reveals that it's androgynous. The feminine head is too small for the thick, solid body. The hands are given a muscular male appearance. This hybrid depiction conveys a mixed message, whereby the robed liberty symbol with French revolutionary associations is transposed to stand for the Germanic cause. Idealistic features coexist with the show of power conveyed by the raised sword held in a clenched fist. The long streaming flag of black, red, and gold displays the tricolor associated with Lützow's volunteer corps that fought against Napoleon in 1813. This tricolor flag of 1848 was used again during the Weimar Republic from 1919 and has been employed once more in Germany since 1949. At the end of Parsifal, ambivalent symbolism is lodged in the tension between Parsifal's merciful healing of the stricken leader on the one hand and his assumption of confident kingship of the Grail community on the other. As Kundry is released from her cycle of reincarnations, she joins the swan, Herzeleide, and Titorel as another figure destined not to survive the path of Parsifal's ascent that sustains the closing redemptive vision. Parsifal is the last of a long line of Wagnerian characters reaching back to Arundel and Die Feen. As Catherine Sire has shown, Arundel's lyre and sword during his concluding trials recalls Lyre und Schwert, the collection of patriotic songs by Theodor Körner, heroic martyr of the 1813 uprisings against Napoleon and subjugated Saxony. At the conclusion of Parsifal, the orchestral harps and upraised spear, instead of lyre and sword, suggest the continued relevance of this general symbolic context. Yet Parsifal's compassionate renunciation and use of the spear for healing do not convey an aggressive nationalism. Within the German context of reception, the decision of the composer's son, Siegfried, to hoist the imperial flag over the Festspielhaus in 1924, instead of the black, red, gold colors of the Weimar Republic, signaled one outcome of a protracted degenerative process involving a chauvinistic narrowing of perspective that became dominant in Germany long before the outset of the Third Reich. Growing from seeds planted by the composer, this development increasingly negated Wagner's modernistic thrust and diminished his international stature. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. We've probably time for a couple of questions if anybody would like to ask something. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these very inspiring thoughts. I think you already answered my question, but I just want to repose it. Because if I get you right, you said that the work cannot absolutely be detached from its reception history. I would like to ask if parts of this reception history is maybe somehow composed in the work. Like if we watch the Hitler picture, I'm just curious on your thoughts. If maybe Wagner kind of saw himself as Parsifal and kind of really transfigured himself in that role, and therefore preceded pictures like this. I'm just curious on your thoughts about that.
In other words, whether Wagner had a kind of narcissistic fantasy with himself being projected in the figure of Parsifal?
Somehow like this, yeah.
Apart from a very generalized level, I think not much. I mean, in the context of the years when he composed Parsifal, the figure who's all the time referred to as Parsifal is Ludwig II. So I don't actually, I think actually this is from my perspective, a very interesting issue, sometimes a disturbing one, and one that often gets oversimplified. For instance, how to interpret certain figures in these dramas in relationship to real-life contexts. An outstanding example of the complexity that was involved with Wagner's development of certain of these characters is indeed Kundry, because there are 3 or even 4 characters in Wolfram's Parsifal that provided models, but so many more. And I don't think I've uncovered all of them. As Catherine Sayers pointed out, Kiristani in Gozzi, who becomes Ada in Die Feen, is a very crucial prototype. Probably the very first one in Wagner's entire experience was Circe. Another one, unmistakable, is Armide, the ambivalent sorceress who was set by Lully, and whose the text, which was then done by Gluck, which was the very first work that Wagner did in Dresden in the 1840s. And there the parallel to Renaud also is carried over to the parallel between Kundry and Parsifal as a pair of characters. Although there can sometimes be casual remarks that identify real-life situations with certain characters, I think Wagner generally invests enough complexity in his main figures that there needs to be a clear distinction here between the reception history context and then the actual work concept. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's the question I was just carrying inside myself, and I'm always, I would never ask this question for another work and for another composer. It's just Wagner in this combination with Parsifal. But I think you're right. It's just wanted to pose it. Thank you.
There's a question I have as well. I suppose with regard to the context of Parsifal and dramatic works coming before it, 2 particular works strike me as interesting from the point of view of what you've been talking about. Well, more now, you've mentioned Armide as well. But I was just wondering what you thought about Parsifal in the context, first of, well, the matter of a new leader replacing the old order, so the magic flute, and particularly with regard to the National Socialist period, in which I'm pretty sure there was some elision between the two. Certainly the way the magic flute was presented, it was almost as Mozart's Parsifal in a way, and Furtwängler, certainly when he conducted the magic flute in Salzburg after the Second World War, wrote a short essay in which he was very anxious to say the magic flute should not be presented in this sort of way. And the second work really being going back to the first day, being Tannhäuser, and the sort of Venus and Elizabeth, in a sense, can one see, Wagner's owing the world a Tannhäuser actually being resolved to a certain extent in Parsifal, because Kundry can actually be seen to combine the two?
Exactly. And that's yet another model, no doubt about it. Nevertheless, there probably were some things that he could have done to Tannhäuser to make it better.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Anthony.
Since you raised the question about reception history and the ways in which Parsifal is politicized or treated as an ideological object, it seems to me from much of your discussion that you've presented the way in which Parsifal at Bayreuth worked in that fashion. But of course, after 1914, Parsifal was no longer the exclusive property of Bayreuth. And I'm curious, the fact that it was, quote, secularized, transported out of the Grail Hall, if that altered the way that people thought about Parsifal, or perhaps it actually provided a broader channel for this particular reading to gain currency within the German or German-speaking public.
Good question. It's important to realize, of course, I'm focusing here on the context of German reception history, and especially in Munich and in Bayreuth. And in the larger situation, to set this into context, as Catherine Sire has pointed out in a recent study, there were as many performances in America of Parsifal in around 1903 to 1904 as there was in Bayreuth in the entire period from 1882 to 1933. Still, I think the situation intensifies in terms of issues of ideological possession. Some of these also relate to Holly Watkins' remarks in the first paper in the following way. It seems to me the issue of place is very interesting. In 1852, Wagner's first idea of a festival in Zurich, the guiding notion was that it would have been a performance of his dramas for a freely committed group of artists, for a public that would be invited without their paying anything, on a wooden stage, and the anti-materialistic vision, in other words, the negation of place, went so far as that he specified, well, we'll burn the stage afterwards. Then there's zero environmental imprint, so to speak. And nevertheless, there's an ideological problem with that, the way it happened with Wagner, because in the early 1850s, this is an anti-materialist vision, and he associates the Jews with the materialistic side of this polarity. What we get by 1913 is exactly the opposite situation, a physical location and a temple, and a group of people who now associate themselves as kind of followers of Wagner, Knights of the Grail, all the rest, and a clan that desperately wants to keep hold of Parsifal as this quasi-sacred work associated with the temple. And one very small but concrete piece of evidence in this regard is Timothy Rybeck's discovering that in Hitler's personal library was this copy of Hoberger's book from 1913 on Parsifal, which makes such a strong plea for retaining the work and restoring it to its rightful owners. It's an issue of spiritual and intellectual property, so to speak. That's what it is. And that was part of the whole angle involving Hitler. They wanted that out of Hitler, to give them Parsifal back. And so I think that there's this intense focus there on a platform from which a group of people would exert political influence. Much more could be said about this, but the prototype was especially Chamberlain, because he had established such a strong alliance with the Kaiser during World War I. The ideological framework here is deeply disturbing and richly textured, but also quite distanced, in a sense, from Wagner's situation when he composed Parsifal, and certainly even more distant from his struggles up to the period of the late 40s.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's probably all we have time for just at the moment. So if we could thank Bill again for a wonderful talk.
Yeah.